The sun hung low over the quiet lakeside town, casting golden streaks across the water as waves gently lapped against the shore. It was the kind of evening where everything felt peaceful, where fishermen wrapped up their day, kids skipped stones, and the scent of fresh pine filled the cool breeze. But that peace was about to be shattered. Maria Thompson had lived here for years, running a small bait and tackle shop near the docks. Everyone in town knew her, kind-hearted, hard-working, always with a warm smile and a helping hand. She was the type of person who remembered your name and your favorite brand of fishing lures. Her son Jake had grown up here too, but he'd been gone for a long time, off serving his country as a Navy SEAL. Since his return, he preferred a quiet life, staying under the radar, enjoying his time back home without drawing attention to himself. But that night, his patience and restraint would be put to the test. It started with the rumble of engines, deep, growling, and menacing. A group of bikers rolled into town, their leather jackets dusted from the road, their faces hardened from years of trouble. They weren't locals, and they weren't here for a friendly visit. The leader, a towering man with a thick beard and cold, calculating eyes, stepped off his bike and cracked his knuckles as he eyed the small bait shop. Maria was closing up for the night, her hands wiping down the counter, when she heard the jarring sound of boots scuffing against the wooden porch. Looking up, she saw them standing in the doorway, 6 men, all rough-looking, all carrying an air of arrogance and intimidation. "Store's closed," she said kindly but firmly, hoping they'd take the hint. The bearded man smirked. "That's so. We just need a few things. Maybe some bait, maybe a little hospitality." His voice was low, edged with something unsettling. Maria didn't flinch. "I can sell you some bait, but if you're looking for trouble, you won't find it here." The group laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that sent a chill through the air. Another man, shorter but stocky, stepped forward and leaned against the counter, his fingers drumming against the wood. "Come on now, lady. No need to be rude. We just want to chat." Maria's heart pounded, but she kept her composure. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, but this was different. These men weren't just being rude. They were testing her, seeing how much they could push before she broke. Outside, another bike pulled into the lot, but the gang didn't notice. The man on it stepped off slowly, removing his helmet, his sharp blue eyes locking onto the scene inside the shop. Jake had come to pick up some supplies before heading out on a late fishing trip, but the second he saw his mother's face through the window, her tight grip on the counter, the way her body stiffened, he knew something was wrong. Jake wasn't just any man. He had spent years in the most elite military unit in the world, trained to handle situations far more dangerous than this. But right now, he wasn't thinking about strategy or tactics. He was thinking about one simple thing: no one disrespected his mother. He pushed open the door, the creak of the hinges cutting through the low hum of tension in the shop. The bikers turned, their amusement faltering as they took in the tall, broad-shouldered man standing before them. Jake wasn't dressed like a soldier, just a simple t-shirt, jeans, and boots. But there was something about the way he carried himself, the way he stood with quiet authority, that made the room feel smaller. "Something wrong, Mom?" Jake's voice was calm, but Maria could hear the edge in it. The leader turned, sizing him up. "And who might you be?" he asked, cocking his head. Jake didn't answer right away. He simply stepped further inside, placing himself between his mother and the group. His eyes never left the bearded man's, unwavering, unreadable. The silence stretched, thick with tension. The bikers, who had moments ago been so sure of their dominance, suddenly felt uncertain. There was something off about this guy, something they couldn't quite place. Maria exhaled, knowing her son well enough to recognize that look in his eyes. This wasn't just a man standing up for his mother. This was a soldier assessing a threat. The leader chuckled, though it lacked the confidence it had before. "We were just having a friendly conversation, no harm meant." Jake nodded slowly. "That right?" His voice was still calm, still measured, but now there was something else in it, a challenge. The bikers exchanged glances. They had come in expecting an easy night, maybe to push around a small-town woman for fun. What they hadn't counted on was running into a man like Jake. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of an unspoken warning hanging between them. The bearded man clenched his jaw, sizing up his options. Then, with a forced grin, he held up his hands. "No problem here. We'll be on our way." Jake didn't move, didn't blink as the men slowly backed toward the door. Only when they stepped outside did he follow, his presence a shadow behind them. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, the leader cast one last glance at Jake, something close to recognition flickering in his eyes. Maybe he didn't know exactly who he was dealing with, but he knew enough. The engines rolled to life, and within moments, the gang was gone, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had come. Inside the shop, Maria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I had it under control, you know," she said, shaking her head with a small smile. Jake finally turned to her, his expression softening. "I know, Mom. Just figured I'd help speed things along." She reached out and squeezed his arm. "Glad to have you home, son." Jake just nodded, but as he looked out toward the empty road, his jaw tightened. He had a feeling this wasn't the last time they'd see those men. And when they came back, if they came back, he'd be ready. The night air felt heavier than before. The rumble of the motorcycles had long faded into the distance, but Jake still stood outside the shop, eyes locked on the dark road. Something about those men didn't sit right with him. He had dealt with all kinds of people in his years of service, people who bluffed, people who bullied, and people who were truly dangerous. These guys, they weren't just passing through. They had a reason for stopping here. And Jake had a feeling they weren't done yet. Maria stepped out onto the porch, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She wasn't the type to let things shake her easily, but even she had to admit that was an uncomfortable situation. She glanced at Jake, who still hadn't moved. "They're gone, you know," she said softly. "For now," Jake murmured, his jaw tightening. Maria sighed, taking a sip of her tea. "You don't have to be on high alert every second you're home, Jake. I know it's in your nature, but this isn't a battlefield. This is just a little town where trouble doesn't last long." Jake finally looked at her. "You really believe that?" She hesitated. The truth was, she didn't know. The way those men had looked at her, the way they had tested her, felt different from the usual troublemakers who sometimes passed through town. But she didn't want to feed Jake's worry. He had already been through enough in his life. He deserved to rest, to breathe, to feel like he was home. "I believe that whatever happens, we'll handle it," she said, offering him a small smile. "Like we always do." Jake nodded, but he didn't feel convinced. He'd seen too much, lived through too many situations where people underestimated threats. He wouldn't make that mistake. The next day, life in town carried on as usual, but the unease from the night before still lingered in the back of Jake's mind. He stopped by the diner that morning, ordering his usual coffee and eggs, but he barely touched his plate. His old friend, Mark, slid into the seat across from him, picking up on his mood right away. "You look like a guy who didn't get much sleep," Mark said, stirring his coffee. Jake exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Just got a feeling about something." Mark, who had been one of Jake's closest friends since childhood, studied him for a moment. "This have anything to do with that group of bikers that came through last night?" Jake's eyes narrowed. "You heard about that?" Mark nodded. "Small town man. Word gets around. Saw them hanging around the old gas station before they hit your mom's shop. Didn't like the look of them." Jake leaned forward. "Did they cause trouble anywhere else?" "Not that I know of," Mark said. "But they weren't just passing through. They were looking for something." Jake felt his stomach tighten. Or someone. Mark set down his coffee, his expression serious. "You thinking they'll come back?" "I'd bet on it," Jake said, his voice low. "And next time, I want to know exactly what they want." That afternoon, Jake took a ride down to the gas station where Mark had spotted the bikers. It was an old, run-down place on the edge of town, the kind of spot where strangers pass through without much notice. He pulled up to the pumps and stepped inside, where the clerk, an older man named Hank, was wiping down the counter. Hank glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Well, if it isn't Jake Thompson. Been a while, son." Jake nodded, giving a small smile. "Been keeping busy. You had some visitors last night." Hank snorted. "Yeah, if you want to call 'em that. Bunch of bikers came through, asking too many questions. Didn't like the look of 'em one bit." Jake leaned against the counter. "What kind of questions?" Hank hesitated, then lowered his voice. "They were asking about you." Jake felt his pulse quicken. "Me?" Hank nodded. "Didn't say your name, but they were looking for some guy who recently came back to town. Kept pressing, wanting to know if anybody round here had a military background. Got real pushy about it." Jake's jaw clenched. So this wasn't random. They weren't just harassing his mom or causing trouble for no reason. They were looking for him. "Did you tell them anything?" Jake asked. Hank scoffed. "You think I'm dumb enough to hand out that kind of information? I told him I didn't know a thing. They didn't like that much, but they left soon after." Jake exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. If these guys were searching for him, it wasn't by accident. The question was, why? He thanked Hank and headed back to town, his mind racing. He had made a lot of enemies in his time as a SEAL, but most of them were half a world away. Could someone from his past be trying to track him down? By the time he got back to the bait shop, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. Maria was inside, stocking shelves, but she immediately noticed the look on her son's face. "What is it?" she asked, setting down a box of fishing line. Jake hesitated for a moment, then exhaled. "They were looking for me, Mom. Last night wasn't random." Maria's face paled. "What do you mean?" "They were at the gas station before they showed up here," Jake explained, asking around, trying to find out if someone in town had a military background. Maria swallowed hard. "But why?" Jake shook his head. "That's what I need to figure out." For the first time, Maria looked truly unsettled. She had always known Jake's work in the military had taken him to dangerous places, but she never thought trouble would follow him home. "Maybe it's nothing," she said, trying to sound hopeful. "Maybe they're just troublemakers looking for someone else." Jake looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't believe that any more than I do." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "What are you gonna do?" Jake didn't answer right away. He glanced out the window, scanning the quiet street. "I'm gonna find out who they are, and I'm gonna make sure they don't come back." Maria reached out, touching his arm. "Jake, just be careful, okay?" He gave her a small nod, but inside, his instincts were already kicking in. Whoever these men were, they weren't done yet, and neither was he. The next few days passed in uneasy silence. Jake kept a close watch on the town, scanning every unfamiliar face, every vehicle that didn't belong. He wasn't paranoid, he was prepared. Something told him those bikers weren't finished, and if they were looking for him, then he needed to figure out why before they made their next move. Maria tried to go about life as usual, but she wasn't fooling anyone, least of all her son. He caught her double-checking the locks at night, glancing over her shoulder whenever she walked out of the shop. She didn't want to admit it, but she was worried, and that only made Jake more determined. One afternoon, he took a ride out of town, following a hunch. Mark had mentioned seeing the bikers hanging around an abandoned service station on the highway before they rolled into town. If they were still in the area, that might be where they were staying. As he pulled up, the place looked deserted, windows broken, rusted signs creaking in the wind. But Jake had spent enough time tracking people in the field to know when a place wasn't as empty as it seemed. He parked his truck a little down the road and approached on foot, staying low, moving quietly. From a distance, he spotted 2 motorcycles parked behind the building, half hidden from the road. He was getting close. Then, voices. Jake pressed himself against the side of the building, listening. 2 men were talking just inside, their voices low but clear enough for him to catch pieces of their conversation. You think he knows yet? One of them asked. Probably, the other muttered. Doesn't matter. We ain't leaving without what we came for. Jake's jaw tightened, so they had a reason for being here. This wasn't some random gang looking to stir up trouble. There was something specific they wanted. You sure this is the guy? Positive. He's the one from the reports. Ex-SEAL. Was part of that team a few years back. Jake's breath slowed. Reports. Team. Whoever these men were, they knew more about him than they should. And that meant they were working for someone else. You think he still has it? Jake frowned. Still has what? Only one way to find out, the man said. And if he doesn't, well, he'll wish he did. Jake had heard enough. He backed away carefully, retreating toward his truck without making a sound. He needed to get back, regroup, and figure out exactly what they were after before it was too late. By the time he made it back to town, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. He pulled into the bait shop, his mind racing with possibilities. Maria was inside, counting the till for the night. She looked up when he walked in, immediately sensing the shift in his demeanor. What did you find? Jake closed the door behind him, lowering his voice. They're not just some random gang, Mom. They're looking for something they think I have. Maria's brow furrowed. But what could they possibly want from you? I don't know, Jake admitted, but they mentioned reports. My team. He paused. This goes back to something from my time in the service. Maria set down the cash drawer, her expression growing more concerned. Jake, do you think they're dangerous? Jake met her eyes. Yeah, and I think they're desperate. Before Maria could respond, the shop's front door opened. Jake tensed, his instincts flaring, until he saw who it was. Mark stepped inside, his expression tight. You were right, Mark said. They're back. Jake's stomach clenched. Where? Bar on the edge of town. They've been there an hour, asking more questions. People are getting nervous. Jake nodded, grabbing his jacket. I'll handle it. Maria caught his wrist before we could walk out. Jake, don't do anything reckless. Jake gave her a reassuring squeeze. I won't, but I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. The bar was dimly lit, the kind of place where locals gathered after a long day. But tonight, the atmosphere was tense. Jake stepped inside, his sharp eyes sweeping the room. The bikers were easy to spot, sitting at a corner table, their leather jackets and heavy boots out of place among the regulars. The bearded leader from before leaned back in his chair, a beer in one hand, a smirk playing at his lips. Jake walked straight toward them, his movements controlled, deliberate. The chatter in the bar quieted as people noticed him, their eyes shifting between him and the gang. The leader looked up, grinning. Well, if it isn't the man of the hour. Jake didn't respond. He pulled out a chair, turned it around, and sat down, arms resting on the back of it. You've been asking about me. The leader chuckled. Guess word travels fast in a place like this. Jake's gaze didn't waver. Let's cut to the chase. Who are you working for? The man raised an eyebrow. Who says we're working for anyone? Jake didn't blink. You do. The way you move, the way you talk, you're not just some small-time gang. Someone sent you. The leader held his stare for a long moment before sighing dramatically. All right, Navy boy, you got me. He leaned in slightly. We're looking for something you were involved with a few years back. Jake remained stone-faced. You're gonna have to be more specific. The leader's smirk faded. You were part of an op overseas. Certain valuable assets went missing. Some very powerful people think you might have been the last one to see them. Jake felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He knew exactly what they were talking about, but he also knew they were wrong. He had nothing to do with whatever they were after. You're wasting your time, Jake said evenly. I don't have what you're looking for. The leader studied him, then chuckled. See, that's what everybody says at first. But the way I see it, you're our best lead. Jake's muscles coiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. So what now? You keep sniffing around my town, hoping I suddenly remember something. The leader's smirk returned. Something like that. Or, if you're not feeling talkative, maybe we start making things a little less comfortable for you. Jake's grip on the chair tightened. That a threat? The leader's eyes darkened. Call it motivation. Jake leaned forward just enough to make the tension spike. You want motivation? Keep pushing me. See where that gets you. The leader held his gaze for a moment longer, then grinned and stood up. We'll be seeing you around, Thompson. With that, he motioned to his crew, and they filed out of the bar, their boots echoing against the wooden floor. Jake sat there for a moment, exhaling slowly. He wasn't scared, had faced worse than these guys. But now he had confirmation. They weren't just looking for him. They were willing to turn up the pressure to get what they wanted. And that meant one thing. This wasn't over, not even close. The ride back to the bait shop was quiet, but Jake's mind was anything but. Every word from that conversation replayed in his head, every unspoken threat hanging in the air. This was bigger than just a few bikers trying to intimidate him. They were after something specific, and they weren't going to stop until they got it, or until he stopped them. As he pulled up to the shop, he noticed something off right away. The front door was slightly open. His mother never left it like that. A spike of adrenaline hit him as he killed the engine and stepped out, his movements controlled but quick. Pushing the door open, he scanned the room. Nothing seemed out of place, at first. Then he spotted the small things. A tipped-over stool. A cabinet door slightly ajar behind the counter. Someone had been here. Mom. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded. Silence. Then a sound. A faint shuffle from the back. Jake moved instantly, stepping silently as he approached the storage room. He eased the door open, every muscle tensed for a fight. But instead of an intruder, he found Maria standing near the back wall, her expression tense. She was gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. Mom, what happened? Maria let out a shaky breath, lowering the phone. Someone was here, Jake. They didn't take anything, but... She hesitated, glancing at the back door, which was slightly ajar. I think they were looking for something. Jake clenched his jaw. They were getting bolder. He stepped past her and checked the lock. It had been forced open, but not broken. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. He turned back to Maria, his expression hard. Did you see them? She shook her head. I heard the door, but by the time I got here, they were already gone. Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. They weren't just testing him anymore. They were escalating. Maria exhaled slowly. Jake, this is getting dangerous. It was already dangerous, he muttered, but now it's personal. The next morning, Jake drove out to Mark's place, needing to regroup. Mark lived on the outskirts of town, a quiet spot with a clear view of the surrounding land, a good place to talk without prying ears. Mark was already outside when Jake pulled up, leaning against his truck with a knowing look. Let me guess. They made a move. Jake nodded, broke into the shop, didn't take anything, just wanted to send a message. Mark let out a low whistle. They're getting impatient. Jake folded his arms. I need to figure out exactly what they're after. If this ties back to an op I was part of, there's got to be a record of it somewhere. Mark tilted his head. You still got contacts. Maybe, Jake said, but if this is what I think it is, digging into it could bring a whole different set of problems. Mark exhaled. So what's the plan? Jake's gaze was cold. We stopped waiting for them to make the next move. That night, Jake sat in his truck outside the bar, watching. The bikers were inside again, laughing, drinking, acting like they owned the place. They had no idea that tonight, the game was changing. Jake waited until one of them stepped outside alone, a younger guy, built like a linebacker, but not as sharp as the others. Perfect. Moving fast, Jake was on him before the guy even knew he was there, grabbing his arm and shoving him against the side of the bar. Start talking. The guy struggled, but Jake tightened his grip, his voice low and controlled. "I know you're looking for something. I know someone sent you. Who is it?" The biker hesitated, eyes darting toward the door. "Man, I don't." Jake pressed harder. "Wrong answer." The biker swallowed. All right. Look, we were told to find you. Our boss. He's got people looking for something you were part of. Some mission, some missing item. We don't know the details. We just know we were supposed to make you talk." Jake narrowed his eyes. "Who's the boss?" The guy hesitated. The steel in Jake's gaze broke his resolve. "Name's Calloway, ex-private contractor. Runs jobs for whoever pays the most." Jake's stomach tightened. He knew that name. Calloway had been a problem overseas, running black market deals, hiring mercenaries to recover lost assets. If he was involved, this was even worse than Jake had thought. "Where is he?" The biker shook his head. "I don't know. I swear. He moves around too much, keeps things quiet." Jake studied him for a long moment, then finally released his grip. The guy stumbled back, rubbing his arm, his expression half anger, half fear. "You tell your crew something for me," Jake said, his voice calm but sharp. "If Calloway wants to find me, he can come himself. But if you keep coming after my family, this ends a lot worse for you." The biker didn't argue. He just nodded, his breathing uneven, before slipping back inside. Jake exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. This wasn't just about some stolen asset from a mission years ago. This was about Calloway making sure no one who had crossed him back then was still around to be a problem now. And Jake, he had just put himself at the top of that list. He drove back to town, his thoughts sharp. If Calloway was pulling the strings, things were about to get worse. Much worse. By the time he reached the shop, Maria was waiting on the porch, worry clear on her face. "Did you find out anything?" she asked. Jake nodded, stepping up beside her. "It's not just some gang, Mom. It's someone from my past, someone dangerous." Maria's expression tightened. "Jake." "I'll handle it," he said before she could argue. Maria looked at him for a long moment, then sighed, shaking her head. "You always say that." Jake forced a small smile. "And I always do, don't I?" But this time he wasn't so sure, because this wasn't just about him anymore. And if Calloway was really coming, then the fight was just beginning. The night was eerily quiet as Jake stood on the porch with his mother. The weight of what was coming pressed down on him, but he couldn't let her see it. Maria had already been through enough, and he wasn't about to let fear creep into their home. Not now. "I know that look," Maria finally said, crossing her arms. "You're thinking of going after them, aren't you?" Jake exhaled. "I don't have a choice, Mom. They're not going to stop." She shook her head, frustration mixing with worry. "Jake, you just got back. You don't owe them anything. Whatever they're looking for." "They think I have it," Jake interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "And until I prove them wrong or take them off the board, they'll keep pushing." Maria opened her mouth to argue, but before she could say anything, headlights appeared down the road. A single vehicle, moving slow, watching. Jake turned, muscles coiling, ready. The car crept past the shop, and for a second, he caught the silhouette of someone inside. Then, just as smoothly, it sped up and disappeared down the street. Maria swallowed hard. "Jake." "I saw it," he said, his jaw tight. "They're watching now." That changed things. They weren't just trying to intimidate him anymore. They were tracking his every move. Maria reached for his arm. "Then maybe we should call the police." Jake sighed. He had already thought about that, but Calloway's people weren't the kind to leave a paper trail. A report wouldn't do much. By the time local authorities took it seriously, it would be too late. "I'll handle it," he said again, and this time Maria didn't argue. Instead, she stepped back inside, locking the door behind her, as Jake stood there, watching the road. But something about that car didn't sit right. The way it slowed, the way the driver positioned himself to look at the shop, as if confirming something. Then it hit him. They weren't just watching. They were making sure someone was home. Jake spun on his heel and rushed inside, locking the front door behind him. "Mom, grab your things." Maria looked up, confused. "What? Why?" "They're not just watching," he said, moving quickly through the house, shutting off lights. "They're planning something." A deep sense of urgency flooded his veins. Calloway wouldn't just send a few guys to spy. If they were confirming his location, it meant something bigger was coming. Maria hurried to pack a small bag, but Jake didn't wait. He grabbed his own go bag, already packed with essentials. Years of military life had trained him never to be caught unprepared. As Maria zipped up her bag, the sound of another car echoed down the street. This time, multiple engines. Jake peeked through the curtain. 2 motorcycles. A black SUV, moving slow. His gut clenched. They were coming. Without another word, he grabbed Maria's hand and led her through the back door, keeping low. The truck was parked behind the shop, out of view from the street. If they moved fast, they could be gone before anyone even made it inside. Maria's breath was shaky, but she followed his lead. She trusted him, even if she didn't fully understand the danger. Just as they reached the truck, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of boots hitting the pavement, multiple sets. Then, a loud knock on the front door. Maria tensed beside him, eyes wide. Jake clenched his jaw. "Get in the truck, now." She didn't hesitate. She climbed in as Jake moved to the driver's seat. Just as he turned the key, a voice from the front, loud, mocking. "Come on, Thompson. We know you're in there." Jake gritted his teeth as the engine rolled to life. He didn't bother waiting to see what they would do next. With a sharp turn of the wheel, he backed out fast, kicking up dust. The second the truck hit the street, one of the bikers ran around the corner, spotting them. There, Jake floored it. The SUV's headlights flicked on, tires screeched. They were following. Maria gripped the door handle as the truck sped down the dark road. "Jake, there." "I know." He took a sharp turn onto a back road, his mind working fast. He had to lose them before they could box him in. The motorcycles gained speed, their engines roaring behind him. The SUV wasn't far behind. Jake's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. They weren't trying to take them out. They wanted to corner them, force them to stop. Not happening. Up ahead, he spotted a side path leading into the woods. It was narrow, uneven. Not ideal for an escape, but it would work against the SUV. Without warning, he yanked the wheel and cut into the dirt road. The truck bounced as it hit the rough terrain, dust and gravel kicking up behind them. The motorcycles followed, but the SUV hesitated. Good. Jake pushed the truck harder, maneuvering between trees, branches scraping against the sides. The bikers were close, but they weren't trained for this kind of chase. Then one of them made a mistake. Too fast on a turn, lost control. The motorcycle skidded sideways, and the rider barely managed to stay upright. It slowed him down just enough. Jake focused on the road ahead, scanning for a way to disappear. Up ahead, the trees thickened, and he spotted an old service road barely visible through the overgrowth. Perfect. Without slowing down, he veered onto the hidden path. It was tight, branches snapping against the truck's frame, but it did the trick. By the time the second biker made the turn, Jake had already disappeared into the darkness. He didn't stop. Not until he was miles from town, the roar of engines long gone. Maria finally exhaled beside him, her hands still shaking. "Jake, what are we going to do?" Jake's grip tightened on the wheel. There was only one option left. He had to go after Calloway first. Jake drove in silence, his jaw clenched, his mind locked onto one thing, ending this. Calloway had sent his people straight to their doorstep, and that meant the man was getting desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, and Jake was about to make sure this was Calloway's last one. Maria sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window. She had always known her son was capable of things most people couldn't imagine, but seeing it firsthand, watching him slip back into that world so effortlessly, was something else entirely. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. Jake didn't take his eyes off the road. To end this before they get another chance. He had spent the last few hours piecing it together. The break-in, the way they kept testing him, the way they tried to corner him. Calloway wanted something, but more importantly, he wanted Jake alive. That meant Jake had leverage, whether he knew it or not. And he knew exactly where to use it. Mark had given him a location, a private airstrip just outside town. It wasn't listed anywhere, just a quiet spot where people like Calloway handled their business away from prying eyes. If Calloway was nearby, that's where he'd be. By the time Jake pulled off the main road and onto the dirt path leading to the airstrip, the sky was dark. The place was quiet, except for a single hangar at the far end of the strip, its lights glowing in the night. Jake killed the truck's engine and turned to Maria. "Stay here. Lock the doors." "Jake." "Mom," he said, his voice softer this time. "Trust me." She nodded, her worry clear, but she knew there was no stopping him. Jake slipped out of the truck, moving low and fast. His SEAL training kicked in automatically, every step calculated, every movement controlled. He could see them now, 3 men standing near the hangar entrance, rifles slung over their shoulders. And then, at the center of it all, stood Calloway. Even after all these years, the man hadn't changed much. Same sharp features, same cold confidence. But there was something different in his eyes now, something that told Jake it wasn't just business. This was personal. Jake stepped into the open. "Looking for me?" The 3 men tensed immediately, but Calloway lifted a hand, signaling them to hold. A slow smile spread across his face. "Jake Thompson, I was wondering when you'd stop running." Jake kept his expression neutral, but inside, he was calculating. Calloway wanted him alive, which meant he had a plan, but Jake had one too. "You've been making a lot of noise," Jake said, keeping his stance relaxed, even as he scanned the area. "Breaking into my shop, following my family. You should have just knocked." Calloway chuckled. "Where's the fun in that?" He took a step closer. "You have something that belongs to me." Jake tilted his head. "You sure about that?" Calloway's smile faded slightly. "You were part of an op years ago, a job that went sideways. Something went missing. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Jake narrowed his eyes. He knew the mission Calloway was referring to. A black market weapons deal had gone south, and a key piece of intel had disappeared in the chaos. But Jake had never taken anything. "I don't have what you're looking for," Jake said evenly. "And even if I did, you're out of time." Calloway's expression darkened. "You're bluffing." Jake smirked. "Am I?" Before Calloway could respond, headlights flashed from the other end of the airstrip. A second vehicle pulled up fast, tires kicking up dust. Jake didn't even have to look to know who it was. Mark stepped out first, rifle in hand, his presence a silent promise that Jake wasn't alone in this fight. Behind him, a few others, guys who owed Jake favors, guys who knew what kind of man Calloway really was. Calloway's men shifted uneasily. Jake took a step forward. "You wanted to make this personal. You wanted to bring this fight to my family." His voice was calm, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "Now it's my turn." For the first time, Calloway hesitated. He hadn't expected this. He had counted on Jake being alone, on him being desperate. But now the tables had turned. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Calloway finally said. Jake's smirk returned. "I think you're the one who needs to start walking." Calloway's men exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping in. Without their leader's confidence, they weren't willing to take the risk. Then, just as Jake had predicted, Calloway did the one thing desperate men always do. He reached for his gun. Jake moved first. In a flash, he closed the distance, knocking the weapon from Calloway's hand before he could even aim. Calloway stumbled back, but Jake wasn't done. A single, well-placed strike sent him to his knees. The other men hesitated, but Mark took a step forward, raising his rifle slightly. "I wouldn't." Silence. Calloway coughed, looking up at Jake with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You should have just given me what I wanted." Jake stared down at him. "I just did. I gave you a reason to disappear." Calloway knew he had lost. Whatever power he thought he had was gone now. Without his men willing to fight for him, without leverage, he was nothing. Jake stepped back. "Leave town. Don't come back." Calloway glared at him, but he wasn't stupid. Slowly, he got to his feet, brushing the dust from his jacket. With one last lingering look, he turned and walked toward his car. His men hesitated, then followed. As the vehicles disappeared into the night, Mark let out a low whistle. Didn't even have to fire a shot. Jake exhaled, the tension finally easing. Didn't need to. The danger was over, for now. As he walked back to the truck, Maria was already standing outside, watching him. "Is it done?" she asked. Jake nodded. "Yeah, it's done." Maria studied his face for a long moment, then sighed, shaking her head. "You always find trouble, don't you?" Jake chuckled. "Trouble finds me." She smiled, but there was something deeper in her eyes. A quiet understanding. No matter how much he tried to leave his past behind, it always had a way of catching up. And somehow, he always found a way to survive. The night air was still thick with tension as Jake leaned against the truck, watching the last set of taillights fade into the distance. He exhaled slowly, letting the adrenaline drain from his body. It was over. Calloway was gone. The threat that had been looming over his family had finally disappeared into the night, and for the first time in days, Jake allowed himself to believe it. Maria stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "You really think he's gone for good?" Jake sighed. "Guys like him don't quit, but he's got nothing left here. No leverage, no men willing to fight for him. He'll move on." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." Mark walked over, stretching his shoulders with a grin. "Well, that was fun. Almost didn't even need to show up." Jake chuckled. "Almost." Mark's grin faded slightly as he gave Jake a serious look. "You know he might try something again down the line. You gonna stick around, or are you thinking about disappearing?" Jake glanced at his mother. The old him, the Navy SEAL, the man trained to fight in the shadows, would have left, would have stayed off the radar, never putting down roots. But the man standing here now was different. He had built something, a home, a quiet life, and most importantly, he had someone who needed him. "I'm staying," Jake said firmly. "For good." Maria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Mark nodded, satisfied. "Then I guess I'll be sticking around too. Just in case some other idiot thinks they can push you around." Jake smirked. Wouldn't have it any other way. The airstrip was silent now, the danger gone, but Jake knew his life would never truly be simple. People like Calloway were everywhere, always looking to take what didn't belong to them, always preying on the weak. But as long as he was here, this town, his home, would never have to deal with men like that again. He and Maria drove back in silence, the events of the night still lingering between them. As they pulled up to the house, the shop was still standing, untouched despite everything. Jake killed the engine and turned to his mother. "You should get some rest." She hesitated, then reached out and squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you, Jake. Not just for tonight, for coming home." Something tight in his chest loosened. He gave her a small nod, watching as she stepped inside, finally allowing herself to breathe. The night was quiet again, but Jake didn't go inside just yet. He leaned against the truck, staring up at the stars. His mind drifted back to all the things he had done, the places he had been. He had spent years fighting battles that weren't his own, living in a world where violence was the only answer. He had always assumed that was the only thing he was good at. But tonight had been different. He hadn't needed to fight, not really. He had outmaneuvered Calloway without shedding blood, proving that strength wasn't just about the ability to take someone down. It was about knowing when not to. A faint breeze rolled in from the ocean, carrying with it the familiar scent of salt and freedom, the kind of freedom he had never really allowed himself to feel until now. Tomorrow, he'd go back to the shop, back to fixing boats, back to the quiet life he had promised himself. There would be coffee in the morning, customers stopping by, old friends checking in. Life would move forward, just as it always did. For the first time in a long time, Jake let himself believe that he wasn't just surviving anymore, he was finally home.